They called it chaos. Smoke in Dar es Salaam, soldiers in the streets, headlines screaming, "Tanzania is burning." But behind every plume of smoke lies a spark the camera missed, the truth of why a calm nation finally raised its voice. For 60 years, Tanzania was the continent's quiet success story, peaceful, predictable, proud. But sometimes peace is not harmony, it is exhaustion, rehearsing obedience. What the world saw as turmoil was perhaps a nation awakening from its own silence. When the news anchor spoke of riots, the people spoke of a remembrance. They were not fighting to destroy their country, they were fighting to recover it. Each chant, each march, each act of defiance was not the sound of collapse. It was the heartbeat of a people remembering how to breathe. Because this is not a story about fire. It is a story about air, about a country gasping for its right to speak and a generation that decided to exhale at last. Stay with us. Because before the night fell silent, Tanzania had already learned that silence itself can be a revolution. It began, as revolutions often do, with numbers that did not make sense. On the morning of 29 October 2025, Tanzania went to the polls under the promise of routine democracy. By nightfall, the promise had been broken. The Electoral Commission announced the results so overwhelming it felt like satire. 97.6% for President Samia Suluhu Hassan. Even the most loyal supporters hesitated before cheering. 97, almost divine perfection. In politics, such perfection often hides a wound. 4 months before that day, warning signs had gathered like storm clouds over the Indian Ocean. Opposition leader Tundu Lissu was arrested on charges of treason and cybercrime. Another challenger, Luhaga Mpina, was disqualified before his name reached the ballot. Civil society groups were restricted, foreign journalists delayed at airports, and international observers from the EAC and SADC were granted only limited access. The stage was set for an election without suspense. Democracy as theater, complete with actors, lights, and an audience forbidden to speak. When the results came, the crowd outside polling stations did not roar. They sighed. One young man, clutching a broken radio, laughed and said, "Even God doesn't get that kind of score." His laughter spread faster than fear. By dusk, that laughter had turned into marches. Dar es Salaam was the first to tremble. Then Arusha, Dodoma, Mwanza. Students poured from dormitories. Market women banged empty pots in rhythm. Taxi drivers blocked intersections. Radios blaring songs once banned from state stations. They carried no flags, only handwritten signs. Our voice cannot be deleted. Western anchors spoke of unrest. Their voices calm, rehearsed, distant. They counted the fires but not the funerals. They showed the smoke but not the silence in between. Those long moments when people simply stood still, hands on heads, wondering how a nation famed for peace had become a land where soldiers outnumbered voters. According to government spokesmen, 10 people were killed. Human rights groups whispered a different number, 700. But truth in those days was measured not in accuracy, but in courage, the courage to speak when words could cost freedom. By the second night, roads were sealed. Tear gas rolled through the avenues of Dar, mixing with humidity and anger. The air itself felt thick with disbelief. For 6 decades, Chama Cha Mapinduzi, the ruling party, had promised stability. But sometimes stability is only the slow suffocation of dissent. International outlets repeated the official line, "Tanzania remains stable." Investors nodded, diplomats tweeted concerned. Yet in the streets, a quieter truth took root, that calm could be a form of control. A journalist from Reuters later wrote that in Tanzania, the cameras captured smoke but missed the size. The size told the real story. This was not chaos for chaos's sake. It was clarity, the nation demanding to be seen. Inside government buildings, officials debated how to respond. Some urged restraint, others repression. One minister reportedly said, "We must switch off the noise before it becomes music." And so, late that night, the signal bars began to vanish. At first, it seemed like a glitch. WhatsApp messages unsent, pages failing to load, but within an hour, the silence spread faster than any rumor. Internet shutdown, a phrase that now defines the modern coup without soldiers. Facebook vanished, X froze, even local news portals went blank. Hospitals lost coordination, journalists lost sources, and families lost contact. In the dark, truth became a rumor and rumor became reality. The government called it a temporary security measure. But when a nation loses its voice, even temporarily, it forgets the sound of itself. In Arusha, students began transferring footage by Bluetooth. In Dodoma, taxi drivers carried printed updates from one neighborhood to another. Someone joked that Tanzania had invented a new kind of network, 3G, gossip, grit, and guts. Humor became resistance, whispers became wires. Each small act of defiance stitched together a fragile new republic of sound. A republic not defined by borders, but by breath. The blackout that was meant to divide people forced them to rediscover each other. Meanwhile, the police hunted for anyone sharing videos, accusing them of spreading fear. Yet fear itself had already changed sides. For the first time, citizens realized that silence was not safety. It was complicity. By the end of that week, the smoke cleared, but the memory remained. In the city squares, burnt posters of the president flapped beside the national flag. The air smelled of tear gas and awakening. One woman, standing amid the ashes of her small shop, said softly to a reporter, "They took our internet, but not our eyes." That sentence captured the spirit of Tanzania 2025, a nation that had spent years whispering, now shouting without sound. The protests were never about one election. They were about the right to feel that voting mattered. Because what the world saw as a riot was, in truth, a referendum, not between parties, but between obedience and dignity. And beneath the smoke and slogans, one haunting question echoed across the coast. If silence can keep the peace, what happens when peace becomes the silence itself? The night grew quiet, but beneath that quiet, something was preparing to speak again. The silence began like a rumor, small, uncertain, almost polite, but within hours, it became total. Tanzania, a nation that had spent a decade online, suddenly vanished from itself. Phones stopped ringing, screens went blank. Even the call to prayer, usually broadcast through crackling speakers, sounded lonelier that night. The government called it a precaution. The people called it what it was: punishment. When the internet disappeared, so did the illusion of connection. Journalists who tried to confirm casualties could no longer reach hospitals. Farmers relying on mobile payments stood idle. Banks froze transactions. Ambulances lost coordinates. The blackout was not just digital, it was moral. Because when truth cannot travel, lies move in convoys. Official bulletins said 10 dead, but whispers said hundreds. The Amnesty International report later called it unlawful killings amid an information blackout. For 3 nights, the only light came from burning tires and phone screens too dim to upload what they saw. The state had cut the signal, but not the memory. Students in Arusha built their own network from Bluetooth and courage, trading footage like contraband. Taxi drivers in Dodoma became couriers of words, ferrying updates from block to block. Across Dar es Salaam, you could feel an invisible current, a country trying to breathe through a closed throat. A boy no older than 19 told a visiting pastor, "They turned off the internet, but not our heartbeat." That line spread quietly, written in chalk on walls before dawn. When language is censored, graffiti becomes gospel. And yet the strangest thing about silence is how quickly people learn to live with it. Within a day, the country adjusted. They stopped refreshing, stopped questioning, as if obedience were oxygen. That acceptance frightened more people than the guns did, because when silence becomes normal, truth becomes foreign. One evening, an old radio host broke down live on air before his channel was shut. "They've stolen our sound," he said, "and when a people lose their sound, they lose their soul." The broadcast ended mid-sentence, but his words traveled faster than the censors could erase them. Outside, posters still fluttered with the face of the president. her smile printed in calm defiance. The state television continued to call it a victory for unity. But on the ground, unity felt like uniformity. It was then that the youth began to understand. The real battle was not for ballots, but for bandwidth. The right to connect had become the right to exist. In small gatherings, under candlelight, students shared data drives, gigabytes of grief, short clips of bodies carried on motorbikes, recordings of gunfire echoing through Dar's narrow streets. These fragments were more than evidence. They were insurance against forgetting, each file a seed buried for a future harvest of truth. Because even when the world cannot see you, history still watches. As Reuters later confirmed, the government's temporary restriction extended for 7 days, one of the longest nationwide blackouts in Africa since Sudan's in 2023. Officials defended it as necessary for national security. But security for whom? For the people or from the people? During those silent nights, Tanzania became two countries. One of noise, the official broadcasts loud with certainty, and one of whispers, the private nation, held together by trust and defiance. Between them stretched the thin membrane of fear that every dictatorship mistakes for loyalty. The world outside barely noticed. Western media ran the usual lines. International community urges restraint. The phrases sounded mechanical, as if recycled from a template of concern. Yet beneath those sterile words, the silence deepened. In the northern districts, electricity flickered out altogether. Villagers lit fires for news, hoping flames might deliver what fiber cables could not. Mothers wept, without knowing whether their sons were alive. Priests offered mass for the missing, though no list existed to read aloud. Still, amid the grief, something sacred was happening. A rediscovery of voice. Silence, intended to suffocate, became a mirror. People began to hear themselves think again. They asked questions once whispered. Why must power fear the truth? Why must unity require amnesia? When the internet finally returned, it carried not just data, but doubt. Hashtags like Tanzania protests 2025 flooded back, each post a pulse of resistance. Within hours, images from hidden phones appeared online. Streets filled with smoke, young faces lit by resolve, police lines dissolving under chants of Haketu, our right. The blackout had failed to bury the story. It had baptized it. Out of darkness came definition, out of silence, sound. And somewhere between those extremes, a generation was born. One that had learned the weight of a paused message, the cost of an unanswered call. In a cafe near Kariakou, a teacher summarized it best. They cut the wires, but not the will. We have learned that silence is a weapon, and now it's ours. But weapons, even when righteous, can wound the hand that holds them. What happens when silence turns into strength, and strength begins to echo? When the silence broke, it did not shatter with gunfire. It cracked with footsteps, thousands of them, bare, blistered, determined. From the dormitories of Arusha to the bus depots of Dar es Salaam, a quiet rebellion began to move. They called themselves nothing, carried no flags, but the rhythm of their march became the new national anthem, the sound of a people rediscovering their pulse. The first to rise were the students. They had lived half their lives online, scrolling through censored headlines, reposting fragments of forbidden truth. When the blackout lifted, they did not wait for permission to speak. They opened their phones like windows and flooded the world with light. Videos of the police crackdowns, of laughter amid smoke, of hands forming the sign of unity. Clips that traveled faster than the state's denials. Soon after came the mechanics, the taxi drivers, the farmers, the ordinary men and women who had been told for years that politics was not their business. Now they understood that silence had made it everyone's business. Markets became meeting grounds, buses became parliaments, and graffiti became the people's press. On the walls of the Doma, someone wrote in bright red, "Our voice cannot be deleted." The phrase spread like a hymn, on notebooks, on t-shirts, even carved into wooden doors. This was no longer protest, it was remembrance, A generation recalling what its parents had been made to forget, that freedom is not the absence of chains, but the presence of choice. Government spokesmen dismissed the gatherings as youth unrest. But these were not riots. They were rehearsals for a future still under construction. Each chant, each phone raised to record, each refusal to run was a blueprint for dignity. The state responded with the same old vocabulary: curfews, patrols, arrests. But control has a half-life. Each time the police silenced one street, 10 more began to sing. The Tanzania protests 2025 were not coordinated by party or ideology. They were powered by something far less predictable: memory. One night, a group of students met under a flickering bulb at the University of Dar es Salaam. They played back the same clip over and over. A young man, his voice trembling, shouting, "We want the Tanzania they promised." No slogans about foreign powers, no party colors, just a plea for honesty. In that moment, they realized they were not fighting the government alone. They were fighting a story. Because dictatorship is not built on guns. It is built on grammar, on who gets to define words like peace, patriotism, or progress. And that was what the youth had begun to rewrite. Outside the universities, the movement grew practical. Farmers blocked roads not to burn, but to barter. We give you food, you give us freedom. Women marched carrying photographs of missing sons, chanting the names the news refused to pronounce. Even small children joined, waving toy phones as if summoning back the signal. Each act, however small, restored a fragment of the nation's broken mirror. International outlets began to notice. Reuters called it a leaderless awakening. BBC Africa Eye released a report showing how footage recorded on offline devices helped verify human rights abuses, later confirmed by Amnesty International. The world began to see what Tanzanians had long known, that courage too can go viral. Still, inside government offices, the fear deepened. Ministers whispered about foreign interference, hinting at cyber warfare. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. The youth had learned to fight with evidence. They were no longer marching for attention, they were archiving for history. A new kind of patriotism emerged, not loud, not choreographed, but personal. A patriotism that whispered, "We deserve better." Taxi drivers decorated dashboards with tiny flags and the words, "Hak yetu, our right." University students wrote essays comparing the internet shutdown to colonial censorship. Even soldiers, anonymous behind helmets, were seen lowering batons when chants turned to songs of the national anthem. It was as if the whole country had rediscovered its reflection, but the most striking transformation was emotional. The anger that once boiled began to cool into conviction. People no longer demanded revenge, they demanded recognition. They spoke of sovereignty not as the power to rule others, but as the right to rule oneself. That redefinition spread beyond Tanzania's borders. Across the Sahel, across the Great Lakes, young Africans repeated the same refrain. You can turn off the internet, but not identity. What began as a blackout had illuminated a continent. Because when a nation learns to speak without permission, it teaches the world that silence is not destiny. It becomes a lesson in Africa's sovereignty, the kind built not on defiance alone, but on dignity. In the end, the Tanzania protests 2025 were less about power than about presence. They reminded an entire people that democracy cannot be downloaded. It must be lived line by line, act by act, breath by breath. But what happens when a movement built on memory meets a government built on forgetting? When truth becomes proof, and proof becomes peril. While the streets of Dar still echoed with chants, the rest of the world pretended not to hear. In the air-conditioned rooms of Washington, silence was renamed strategic patience. The U.S. State Department issued its predictable statement: "We urge all parties to exercise restraint." No condemnation, no recognition, just the diplomatic art of looking away. Because as long as the ports stayed open and the contracts stayed stable, outrage could wait. In Brussels, the European Union expressed deep concern, but continued development programs unchanged. For them, Tanzania's problem was not democracy, but disruption. Protest made investors nervous. In London, analysts on late-night panels spoke of Africa's balancing act between sovereignty and stability. They used the words interchangeably, as if the right to speak and the right to survive were the same commodity. Yet not everyone remained mute. Amnesty International demanded a full inquiry into the deaths, citing satellite data of fires during curfew nights. Freedom House downgraded Tanzania to not free, warning that a democracy maintained by censorship was a silence too expensive to afford. Still, their reports rarely reached Tanzanian screens. Truth, it seemed, traveled faster abroad than at home. Inside the African Union, debate grew tense. Some leaders argued that Tanzania's unrest was an internal matter. Others whispered that what was happening in Dar could easily ignite elsewhere. In Nairobi, commentators on Citizen TV asked the question no Western network dared: when does sovereignty become a shield for abuse? Regional bodies like the EAC called for dialogue. The CDC offered mediation, but the government in Dodoma declined. "We need no babysitters," one minister said. "Africa solves African problems." The irony was not lost on the youth who were still being beaten for demanding that same Africa listen to its own. Meanwhile, China praised the government's commitment to order, quietly extending new credit lines for infrastructure. Russia, ever opportunistic, offered cybersecurity training for police, each power speaking the language of friendship, each transaction written in the currency of silence. But the loudest response came not from governments, but from the African street. In Lagos, murals appeared, showing a young Tanzanian holding a cracked phone, glowing with light. In Accra, radio hosts recited the phrase, "Our voice cannot be deleted," as if it were a proverb. Hashtags in Swahili and Yoruba, French and Hausa began to converge under one banner: Africa, sovereignty. For the first time, the continent's youth were united not by borders, but by bandwidth. They saw in Tanzania a mirror of their own nations, where peace was often mistaken for permission and democracy for decoration. The protests had ceased, but the questions had only begun. Could Africa speak with one voice when its leaders still feared the echo? Could sovereignty mean partnership, not paternalism? Because when the world chooses silence, it leaves Africa to answer the question alone. What does freedom sound like when no one is listening? By the end of 2025, the smoke had faded, but the questions remained, hanging like dust over the city. Tanzania had survived its loudest year, but what kind of country had emerged from the silence? The government called it reform through resilience. The people called it something else: survival. On the surface, the nation moved forward. The standard gauge railway roared across the plains, the Mwalimu hydropower project thundered along the Rufiji River, and cranes dotted the skyline of Dar es Salaam. Ministers spoke proudly of self-reliance, of projects built without foreign loans. "We do not bow to the IMF," one declared. "We build for ourselves." And in a way, they were right. The world admired Tanzania's defiance, its courage to say no to the usual Western chorus. But beneath the rhetoric lay an older contradiction: sovereignty abroad, silence at home. You cannot preach independence to foreigners while punishing it in your citizens. You cannot demand respect while denying it to your own. In the markets of Dodoma, traders murmured about new taxes. Journalists still vanished quietly. Yet young people remained restless, no longer afraid. They had tasted the power of their own connection, not Wi-Fi, but witness. A generation had learned that progress measured only in concrete is not progress at all. Still, hope persisted. New community radios began broadcasting uncensored debates from rural regions. Local teachers formed reading circles using banned books. Churches opened night classes on civic rights. It was small, fragile, but real. The rebirth of a public voice. Abroad, African commentators spoke of Tanzania as a test case. Could the nation balance control and creativity, order and openness? Could it turn the pain of protest into a policy of participation? The African Union quietly encouraged dialogue-led reform. But real change would not come from conferences. It would come from conversation, from the courage to keep speaking even when no one answers. Because the challenge now is not to fight the silence, but to fill it with meaning. To build a country where criticism is not treason, where sovereignty is not a slogan, and where progress does not require permission. If Tanzania succeeds, it could become a blueprint for post-colonial renewal, a nation proving that Africa's strength lies not in uniformity, but in unity of purpose. But if it fails, it will remind the world how quickly pride can turn into prison. The path ahead is steep, the soil is heavy, yet as every farmer in the plains knows, no harvest comes without breaking ground. The youth have planted their seed, memory. Now the question is whether the state will water it with justice or with fear. Because a nation that once fought to speak must now learn to listen, to its people, to its pain, to its promise. There was never a moment of surrender, only a pause, a breath, a choice. Tanzania did not collapse. It exhaled. Out of smoke came vision. Out of silence came song. Out of fear came a truth too long postponed. That peace without justice is only quiet oppression, and progress without participation is only another kind of a poverty. The Tanzania Protest 2025 were not just about an election or a number, they were about voice, the oldest form of freedom. They reminded the continent that democracy is not a gift bestowed by power, but a habit built by courage. And when that courage speaks, even the mightiest silence trembles. Across Africa, the echoes remain. From Accra to Addis, from Lagos to Lusaka, citizens ask the same question. Can sovereignty exist without accountability? Can Africa's sovereignty mean both independence from others and interdependence among ourselves? Tanzania's story is not finished. The roads still gleam, the power plants still hum, and the government still speaks the language of progress. But beneath that noise lies a deeper rhythm, the heartbeat of a nation learning to define freedom in its own accent. Perhaps years from now, the headlines will change. No longer Tanzania is burning, but Tanzania is becoming. Because every nation must pass through the fire to find its voice, and every people must lose connection before they understand community. This was never just about one country's crisis, it was about an entire continent reclaiming its reflection, no longer waiting for Western cameras to explain its tears. It was about a generation that realized truth travels faster when carried by the people themselves. And so, as the dust of 2025 settles, one lesson remains. Sovereignty begins with the courage to speak, but it endures only through the humility to listen. Not charity, not pity, sovereignty, not silence, not fear, freedom. Not progress for display, but dignity in practice. If a nation, once muted, can rise to rewrite its story, what stops the rest? Stay awake, stay steadfast, stay sovereign.